Welcome to Recap King. In this video, we will explain the end of the world. This series tells the story of a 17-year-old boy who is pretty sure he is a psychopath. He then met a cool and moody new girl at school. The pair make a connection, and she persuades him to embark on a road trip searching for her real father. What is the story of the adventures of these two delinquents? Let's find out in the end of the world. The end of the world tells the story of a 17-year-old boy named James who firmly believes that he is a loony. James lives with his father, who is very considerate of him but has a bad sense of humor. When he was 8 years old, James killed many animals as a hobby. Because of that, he thought that he was a loony. James, who is tired of killing animals, then intends to kill someone to increase his experience and establish himself as a complete loony. At school, James meets a girl named Alyssa who is his classmate. Alyssa is a typical rebellious and outspoken girl. Unlike James, Alyssa comes from a broken home. Her mother remarried to a man who never liked her presence in her house, and Alyssa had not seen her biological father since she was 8 years old. Because her mother already had another child from her stepfather, she became less attentive to Alyssa. So Alyssa grew up to be a rebellious teenager and behaved casually. When James met Alyssa at school, he decided to make Alyssa his first human victim. James then pretends to like Alyssa to get closer to her and kill her more easily. James' approach worked and the two of them finally officially started dating. Alyssa turns out to be an aggressive girl and wants to consummate their relationship as soon as possible. But not so with James, who has other goals by making Alyssa his girlfriend. James then invited Alyssa to lunch at a restaurant. But because Alyssa was always forthright in her behavior and words, the waitress who served them became offended, so they decided to leave. After that, Alyssa suggested that they go to James' house. Hearing this, James immediately agreed and thought he could finally take Alyssa's life at his house. Arriving at James' house, Alyssa looked around the living room. She seemed interested in a photo and asked James about it. James replied that the woman in the photo is his mother, who is currently in Japan. James and Alyssa then sat on the swing in the backyard, where Alyssa was aggressive again, but James didn't seem to care. Not long after, James' father, Phil, came home and found Alyssa making sandwiches in the kitchen. The man looked happy when he found out that James had a girlfriend. Phil tried to crack a joke while the three of them were chatting, but Alyssa blatantly says that Phil has a terrible sense of humor and an obnoxious demeanor. Before leaving, Alyssa reiterated to James that she wanted to consummate their relationship. James couldn't help but agree, and they agreed to do it the next day at James' house. The next day, James had prepared himself to carry out his action to kill Alyssa. James had also prepared his weapon, namely a knife which he had hidden under the pillow. But Alyssa never came because it turned out that she had to help her mother serve the guests who came to the party held at their house. When Alyssa was in the kitchen alone, her abusive stepfather, Tony, approached Alyssa and told her to leave the house because he was fed up with having her in his house and didn't want to see her again. Unexpectedly, Alyssa's mother, Gwen, apparently overheard the conversation. But Gwen didn't say anything to defend her daughter and instead walked away from them. Seeing her mother's attitude, Alyssa became very sad and thought that her mother no longer loved her, so she decided to leave the house. Alyssa then meets James at his house and suggests that they run away together, hoping for an adventure that is both fun and thrilling and leaves the boring and frustrating home life behind. Without thinking, James agreed to Alyssa's proposal to get a chance to kill her. When Phil finally got home, James rushed to punch his dad in the face, stole his car and ran away from the house with Alyssa. During their escape, Alyssa seemed so excited because she was finally free from her abusive father. Meanwhile, James is still planning to kill Alyssa and can't wait for the right moment to do it. After that, Alyssa and James entered the shooting game arena, but because they were secretly trespassing, the security guards caught the two of them, so they both ran away from there. James and Alyssa then have lunch at a restaurant and they discuss money, which they both admit to having no money at all. Alyssa then asked how they would pay the bill for lunch at the restaurant, but James didn't say anything and immediately rushed out of there, followed by Alyssa. After they escaped without paying the bill for their lunch at the restaurant, Alyssa realized that James was quite an attractive young man and she liked him even more. Alyssa then forced James to take off his shirt. Because James was driving, he became difficult to control the steering wheel and made him lose focus, so his car crashed into a tree. Because their car was damaged and caught fire, they then tried to find a ride on the side of the road. Not long after, a man named Martin stopped his car and kindly offered to give James and Alyssa a ride. James then told Martin that his mother had died a long time ago. Alyssa also realized that James had lied to her because earlier, he said that his mother was in Japan. The three of them stopped by a restaurant for dinner. Alyssa apparently does not like Martin and openly shows her dislike in front of him, but apparently, Martin didn't really care. Alyssa, who felt disgusted, then left James and Martin. James then apologized to Martin for Alyssa's rude attitude. James then went to the toilet and Martin followed him. When Alyssa returned to the restaurant and could not find James and Martin, She looked for them in the toilet and found them standing close together there. The clever Alyssa then uses this to blackmail Martin by threatening to report him to the police on charges of sexually assaulting James. Because Martin didn't want to be reported to the police, he gave Alyssa his wallet and all the money he had. After that, James and Alyssa went to a motel for the night. While in the room, Alyssa, who suddenly felt sad, then rushed to the bathroom. James took his knife and got ready in front of the bathroom to kill Alyssa when she came out of there. But apparently, James heard Alyssa, who was sobbing in the bathroom, so he stopped his intention. Alyssa then called her home to talk to her mother, but her stepfather wouldn't let her talk to her mother and asked her not to contact them anymore. After that, Alyssa asked James to help her find her real father, and James was willing to help her. The next day, after they checked out from the motel, Alyssa seemed undecided about her decision to find her real father. On the way, James and Alyssa saw a mansion and decided to infiltrate it. After making sure that no one was in the house, James and Alyssa went in by breaking the window. Alyssa looks enthusiastic because the house is very large and has a large collection of expensive alcoholic drinks. She did not waste it and immediately drank a bottle of wine, then invited James to have fun. Because she was drunk and carried away, Alyssa then kissed James and wanted to consummate their relationship. But James seemed uncomfortable when Alyssa did it and asked her to stop by making absurd excuses. Angry, Alyssa then left the house and met a young man named Topher. Without thinking, Alyssa kissed Topher and took him to the mansion. Alyssa tells James that she is going to have sex with Topher. Without waiting for a response from James, she immediately took Topher upstairs while James was busy checking the host's belongings. How surprised James was when he found several photos and video recordings showing the torture carried out by the house owner on several young women. James immediately realized that the house owner was a rapist and serial killer. Even though he always thought he was a psychopath, he was disgusted by the video footage and did not feel any pleasure in watching it. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Alyssa apparently lost interest in having sex with Topher and told him to get out of there immediately. Topher, annoyed that he was being played with, hurriedly left the house. James thought of a way to kill Alyssa again. He waited for Alyssa in front of her room until Alyssa fell asleep before entering the room. James saw Alyssa was fast asleep, but he did not carry out his actions and instead lay on the floor looking at Alyssa's hands. At the same time, the house owner, a man named Clive, finally came home and was very surprised to find his house in disarray. James, who realized the arrival of the house owner, then hid under the bed. Not long after, Clive entered the room and found Alyssa sleeping in his bed. Alyssa, who finally wakes up after realizing Clive's arrival, begs him not to report it to the police. Clive instead closes the door and tries to rape Alyssa. Unable to stay silent, James came out of his hiding place and immediately stabbed Clive in the neck until the man finally died of blood loss. James, who panicked because he finally managed to kill someone, suggested to Alyssa that they turn themselves into the police and said the murder was for self-defense. But Alyssa said that the police would not believe it because, in reality, they entered Clive's house without permission. James and Alyssa then cleaned and tidied everything up and erased their fingerprints and whereabouts in the house. James also threw away the knife he used to stab Clive somewhere hidden. He then tells Alyssa about the photos and video footage of the torture that Clive inflicted on several young women. Alyssa then lines the photos and video footage around Clive's corpse, burns their belongings to eliminate evidence, and rushes away from there. They then changed their appearance and went to the bus station. The next day, Clive's body was found by his mother, Flora, who came to visit his house. However, before the police arrived, Flora collected the photos of the women who were victims of Clive and then burned them, then kept the camera. Not long after, two policewomen, Eunice and Terry, come to Clive's house to investigate the man's death. They conclude that Clive was the victim of a murder and managed to find a clue, namely Topher's wallet, that was accidentally dropped. Eunice and Terry immediately interrogate Topher, but he admits that he doesn't know Clive and tells him about a 17-year-old girl named Alyssa and a boy named James. Meanwhile, James and Alyssa go to a restaurant after changing their appearance. Alyssa asks about the knife James used to stab Clive, but James didn't explain anything to her. Alyssa then went to the toilet and decided to leave James because she realized something was wrong with him. On the other hand, James, who realized that Alyssa had left him, looked very shocked and frustrated, even desperate to pay some people he met on the street to beat him. James finally realized that he was not a psychopath like he thought all along and realized that Alyssa was his guardian angel. After that, he decided to call the police. The scene then switches to the past, when James was 6 years old, at which time James and his mother were going to the lake to feed the ducks. However, James's tragedy happens when he sees his mother ends her life by drowning herself in the lake. Turning to the present, James is at the police station to report the murder he committed. However, when he was there, he then gave up his intention and instead told about the incident which was committed by his late mother 11 years ago. When James was about to be taken to a social institution for rehabilitation, he rushed to escape from there when the policeman was off guard. Meanwhile, Eunice and Terry, who is investigating the Clive murder case, manage to get information about James and Alyssa and visit their house. The scene then switches and shows Alyssa, who is menstruating and not wearing a sanitary napkin. Alyssa, who realized that she had no money, then decided to steal underwear at a shopping center. However, security officers, a man named Emil, soon discovered her action and immediately locked her in his office. But because Emil has to deal with the problem of a little girl who went missing in the shopping center, he then has to leave Alyssa, who managed to escape from there. After leaving the shopping center, Alyssa accidentally met a little girl who was declared missing. Feeling sorry, she took the little girl to her parents. Emil, who realized that Alyssa was actually a good girl, then decided to let her go. Elsewhere, James, who managed to escape from the police station, decides to return to the restaurant, hoping that Alyssa will also return there and be together again. Sure enough, Alyssa also came to the restaurant and apologized for leaving James not long ago. James seemed happy that Alyssa came back to him and promised never to leave her again. They both stole a car parked in a deserted alley and went back on their way to find Alyssa's biological father. Meanwhile, the police who investigated the case of Clive's death managed to find the knife used by James to kill Clive. After a long journey, James and Alyssa's car ran out of fuel. Having no money at all, they then planned to commit theft at a gas station. Seeing Alyssa's suspicious behavior, a woman who was the petrol station manager approached Alyssa and asked James to turn off the car engine while refueling. Since James turned off the engine without using the car keys, the woman grew suspicious and signaled to her employee, a young man named Frodo, to call the police. But because Frodo did not understand the hint from the manager, the woman finally asked Alyssa to come into the shop and pay the bill. Having no money, Alyssa also intends to run away by pretending to go to the toilet. But then the woman rushed to immobilize Alyssa and told Frodo to call the police. Seeing Alyssa in a state of urgency, James rushed to help her by pretending to point a gun at them. But the woman found out that James had no gun at all and asked what kind of gun it was. Unexpectedly, James can describe one type of gun very accurately. After that, he tried to save Alyssa and quickly pushed the woman into a room. Frodo, who saw this, instead helping James and Alyssa lock his manager in the room. Frodo was apparently fed up with the behavior of his manager, who always underestimated him, and said that he was fed up with his life. Frodo, who intended to go with James and Alyssa, then gave them some needed things. But James and Alyssa could not allow Frodo to come along and immediately rushed away from him. Elsewhere, James' father, Phil, is being interrogated by Eunice and Terry about the knife in James' possession. Phil said that James asked for the knife as his 13th birthday gift, and according to him, this was natural, while insisting that James was not a dangerous teenage boy. Eunice and Terry then found reports of several young women who were victims of sexual harassment by Clive, who turned out to be a teacher. When they questioned Clive's mother, Flora, the old woman denied the allegations and defended her son. However, Eunice, who believed that all the accusations were true, suggested Flora tell the truth. The next day, Flora comes to the police station to meet Eunice and hands over a videotape of Clive's torture of several young women. Meanwhile, in the middle of the trip, Alyssa took the time to call her mother and said that she would never return home. Gwen is very worried about Alyssa's safety and continues to persuade her daughter to go home. But Alyssa still refused and openly said that she really hated her stepfather. James and Alyssa finally arrived at the home address of Alyssa's biological father, Foley, but a woman who lived there said that Foley had moved from there and gave the man's address to James and Alyssa. Meanwhile, Eunice and Terry managed to track down the location of James and Alyssa after they carried out a robbery at a gas station and were caught on a CCTV camera. Long story short, James and Alyssa finally found Foley's home address, and when Alyssa met Foley, the man immediately recognized Alyssa as his daughter and greeted her with warm hugs. Foley then invited James and Alyssa to enter his house. When Alyssa and her father were involved in a conversation, James chose to make room for them to let go of their longing after not seeing each other for a long time. Alyssa said that James is her boyfriend and expressed her desire to live with Foley for a while, and her father immediately allowed it. The next day, Foley challenged James to a game of knife throwing, and it turned out that James was quite good at the game, so Foley liked him. The scene then switches and shows Gwen, her husband, and Phil at the police station and watching CCTV camera footage showing James and Alyssa committing a robbery at a gas station. Gwen saw this, then blamed James for involving her daughter, while Phil could only bow his head in resignation to see his son's behavior. Turning back to James and Alyssa, Foley said he wanted to take James and Alyssa out on a cruise, but then, a man named Jono came to see Foley and said that he had work to do that day. James and Alyssa then realized that Foley is a drug dealer, and James thinks that they might not be safe living with him, but Alyssa insists that her father will protect them. Meanwhile, at the police station, Eunice and Terry conclude that Alyssa may have gone to see her biological father, Foley, and rush to the address where the man last lived. However, upon arrival, they only meet a woman named Debbie who lives there, who turns out to be Foley's ex-girlfriend. Even though Debbie had previously met with Alyssa and told her Foley's new address, but this time she kept silent and didn't say anything to the police. Eunice then gave Debbie her business card and asked her to contact her if she had any information about James and Alyssa. Afterwards, when Foley takes James and Alyssa to a bar, Debbie goes to him to ask him for money to buy a new school uniform for their son. Alyssa, who just found out that Foley has a son from another woman, looks very shocked that he has hidden this fact from her. Fed up with Foley, Debbie then tells Eunice the address of Foley's new home. That night, while Foley was watching the news on television, the man finally found out that James and Alyssa had committed a crime and now the police are looking for their whereabouts. Meanwhile, Eunice, who went to Foley's house alone, could not find James and Alyssa because they both chose to spend the night on the beach. Eunice then decided to wait in her car while watching the situation there. The next day, Eunice saw the whereabouts of James and Alyssa, who entered Foley's residence. Meanwhile, Alyssa and James, planning to escape using Foley's boat, urged Foley to give them the keys to his boat. But Foley said that he had learned of their crimes and that whoever caught them both would be rewarded. Foley is apparently tempted by the reward and intends to take Alyssa and James to the police station. He secretly calls the police and persuades Alyssa to tell the truth. Alyssa then told everything to her father, but James soon realized that something was wrong and found Foley's cell phone. James immediately turned off the cell phone and pointed a gun at Foley, while Alyssa stabbed Foley in the thigh. Not long after, Eunice arrived there and tried to persuade James and Alyssa to turn themselves in, especially James, because he was now 18 years old and was considered an adult. James and Alyssa had almost given themselves up to Eunice, who had promised to help them file an appeal, but Foley screwed things up by saying that no cops could be trusted. Alyssa panicked and then hit Eunice until she fell unconscious, then ran away with James. However, when they were about to escape by boat, suddenly the seawater receded, so James had no other choice but to protect Alyssa. Meanwhile, Terry and the other cops were already there and immediately chased them to the beach. James intends to bear it all alone by saying that he has kidnapped Alyssa and forced her to help him kill Clive and rob the gas station so that Alyssa is not blamed. After that, James was forced to hit Alyssa until she fell while she fled from the police chase. The first season of this series is finally over. The moral we can learn from this film is that sometimes we feel indecisive and unsure about our decisions and actions and whether they will impact our lives and other people's. However, keep holding on to one thing, namely, whatever choices, decisions, and actions we take, remain human beings who humanize others. Never lose the humanity in us, even when faced with very complicated situations. And also, never be afraid to admit mistakes and take responsibility for our actions, because all of that will make us better than before.